The big story today, the leaders of G20 nations wrapped up their summit in Bali with a joint declaration condemning the war in Ukraine. In a strong statement, the joint communique said the G20, and I quote, deplores Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, remember, did not attend the summit. Russia's foreign minister, who attended the event, was not present on the last day. Meanwhile, India has taken over the G20 presidency from Indonesia. Kiran Khatri wraps up what was an eventful G20 summit and previews the high-profile gathering that will take place in India next year.
G20 leaders in Bali woke up to news of an explosion in Poland which killed at least 2 people near the Ukraine border. US President Joe Biden called for an emergency meeting of G7 and NATO leaders on the sidelines of the summit. After the meeting, Biden said it was unlikely that the missile was fired by Russia.
Contest that. I don't want to say that till we completely investigate, but it's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia, but we'll see.
The G20 joint declaration condemned the war in Ukraine in strong terms. The statement said it deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and demands its complete and unconditional withdrawal. The statement went on to say the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, the peaceful resolution of conflicts, efforts to address crisis, as well as diplomacy and dialogue are vital. Today's era must not be of war. These words echoed what Prime Minister Modi said at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit in September.
India played a key role in the successful negotiations of the outcome document. Prime Minister's message that this is not the era of war and that the best way is to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy to resolve the conflict resonated very deeply across all the delegations.
Post the final declaration, it was time for Indonesia to hand over the G20 presidency to India by passing the honorary gavel. India will hold a high-profile gathering next year. In the build-up, there will be 200 meetings across 32 different sectors, culminating in the summit on September 9th and 10th of 2023.
आज मैं ये आश्वासन देना चाहता हूं कि भारत की G20 अध्यक्षता इंक्लूसिव, एम्बिशियस, डिसिसिव और एक्शन ओरिएंटेड होगी। एक्सेलेंसी, अगले 1 साल में हमारा प्रयत्न रहेगा कि G20 नए विचारों की परिकल्पना के लिए और सामूहिक एक्शन को गति देने के लिए एक ग्लोबल प्राइम मूवर की तरह काम करे।
From sessions on health and digital transformation to bilateral meetings with world leaders, PM Modi had a packed schedule in Bali. He held bilateral talks with leaders of Germany, Italy, France, and the UK. The new British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak approved 3,000 work visas for Indian professionals after meeting Prime Minister Modi. However, there was no bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and China's President Xi Jinping. Both leaders came face-to-face at a dinner and exchanged pleasantries, but they have not held any bilateral talks since the clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers in Galwan Valley in May 2020. One of the highlights of the summit was the meeting between President Xi and President Biden, where they reached common ground in warning Russia over the use of nuclear weapons and agreeing to restart climate talks to cut emissions. President Biden also said he does not believe there's any imminent attempt by China to invade Taiwan. One leader who skipped the G20 summit was Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did represent Russia in his place. However, he left the summit before the joint declaration condemning the Ukraine war was released. In Mumbai with Kiran Khatri, Arundhati Ramanan.
Well, as India takes over the G20 presidency, we're now joined by India's G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Kant. Mr. Kant, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. I know this is a very busy day for you, and I suspect you're currently traveling from one location in Bali to another, so appreciate your time. First of all, congratulations and luck on taking over the G20 presidency, which comes India's way. I want to get you to give us the backstory of what really has transpired in the last 48 hours to ensure that there was a consensus on the G20 final communique. The draft did see plenty of back and forth, I'm given to understand, but finally there seems to have been a change, especially in the paragraph that addresses the Russia-Ukraine war. If you can share with us what went on in the last 48 hours.
Shereen, these were very complex and very tough negotiations because many countries were involved. There was total deadlock over the last 6 days. In the last 48 hours, India worked in partnership with all developing and emerging markets to ensure that we could build consensus around the para on geopolitics. The challenge of Russia-Ukraine war, breakdown of supply chains, many other issues were very, very complex and complicated. And the para, which was originally being drafted, was not a para, it was a very long statement, which was very one-sided. All of us felt that it should be instead of G20 getting into issues of security and war, etc., it's not essentially a forum for security. It's a forum for growth and progress, and therefore we should fall back on the UN resolution. So we had to work through 2 difficult nights to finally convince the G7 that we should go back to the UN resolution, pick up components of that, and really spell out the voting pattern as given in the UN resolution, and then conclude with what the Prime Minister Modi had said, that this is the age of diplomacy and dialogue, and this is not the era of war. Even this was objected to by some countries in our neighborhood, but we fought, and finally, I think all the emerging markets managed to stand together and convince all the G7 countries that G20 should stand united in this moment of crisis. And finally, everybody came together, and at the last minute,
Right. Mr. Kant, you're saying that there were objections and there was a lot of back and forth at the draft stage of the communique. But, I'm looking now at the final text, and several reports confirmed what you've just told us, that India, along with some other emerging nations, did manage to broker that consensus as far as the wording on the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned. The final text says there were other views and different assessments of the situation and sanctions, recognizing that the G20 is not the forum to resolve security issues. We acknowledge that security issues can have significant consequences for the global economy. Again, where did we find the support to ensure that the draft was changed and this was the final outcome? I would imagine that this required a lot of dialogue, a lot of diplomacy. Take me through what finally got us this breakthrough.
Yeah. So actually, India led the way, but I think a good thing was that Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, but even Turkey, all of them joined hands with us to say that we need an even balanced statement. It can't be condemnation all the way. There are various challenges. And we managed to convince G7 at the last minute that you can't have a statement which is totally political in nature. And therefore, our focus should be on growth. This is the moment when the world needs growth. This is the moment when the world needs progress on sustainable development goals.
Yes, and that clearly seems to have changed the draft to what we finally saw emerge in the text as far as the Russia-Ukraine paragraph is concerned. Mr. Kant, I now want to talk about some of the other aspects that the G20 has focused on. Then there are a whole host of issues, of course, from food security to climate change to cryptocurrencies. There are quite a lot of paragraphs in the statement that deal specifically with the issue of food security and the challenge that presents in the current scenario. The statement also talks about the pandemic fund, vaccines, etc. But I want to focus on food security because that has clearly gathered the attention of world leaders. It's been acknowledged as one of the biggest challenges that the world faces today. In that context, will there need to be a nuancing of India's position on food security? Because we did bring in export curbs, restrictions, bans, etc. In light of what the G20 communique now says, will there need to be a further nuancing?
So, there are 3 key issues. Food, fuel, and fertilizer came in a huge amount of discussion because it was felt that the food supply from both Russia and Ukraine, the food and the fertilizer supply from both these countries need to be totally unlocked. And therefore, as you read through the document, you will find that both the initiative taken by the Solidarity Lanes, it's called, the initiative taken by Europe, all of them find the mention in the document, and that these need to be continued, extension needs to be provided, because unless and until you don't get food and fertilizer moving from the ports in Ukraine and Russia, and unless and until the present this is continued, the agreements or continued extension is provided, you will feel a huge shortage. And if fertilizer is not provided, is adequately supplied, there will be a huge challenge in terms of productivity, agriculture production for the next year, and therefore the world will see a huge imbalance in demand and supply. And therefore you need to continue this. Actually, this was a subject of a full-day debate and discussion amongst G20. Therefore, a consensus was arrived at on this food and fertilizer issue, and even today, at the main meeting, the United Nations Secretary General, many leaders talked at length about the food and fertilizer issue. But this is really the key to ensuring that we are able to solve the problem of hunger or poverty. Otherwise, a vast segment of the world will go below poverty line without food. And therefore, there is a very clear consensus that these must be continued.
Yes, the commitments made as far as ensuring food security are continued. Mr. Kant, I know that we were going to have to get you back on a day that you have a little more time, perhaps when you're back in India, to talk in more detail on the road ahead as far as India's G20 presidency is concerned. But appreciate you joining us today and giving us a sense of what transpired, especially over the last 48 hours, to ensure that there was consensus on the draft that was finally issued as the final communique from the G20. Thanks very much for joining us.